Hello and welcome to number 9 in the series of podcasts on Chinese Australian history. As I say, this is mostly a podcast by Child Study Press, which is designed to summarise some of the publications of Child Study Press. But in this case, what we're doing is a bit of a summary of a book that is yet to be written. It's a book that I'm writing about the Amoy men, the Amoy Shepherds, which is today's topic. What I've done is, because that's an interesting story, I've made a bit of a summary of it to introduce it to people. The book itself is, as I said, in the middle of being written and probably won't come out for a little while. It's tentatively titled Men of the 18 Wards, which is how men of Amoy signed a protest poster that they posted up in Amoy in the 1850s when they were protesting this very indentured labour system that brought some 3,000 men to Australia in the 1840s and 1850s. So we'll be talking about those details later on, but today it's more about just a general summary of what was happening to kind of give you an idea, if you don't know about this aspect of Chinese Australian history. One thing before I introduce the bots to discuss this is their pronunciation of shaman. So Amoy is today's shaman, and the pronunciation that we get from the bots is a little bit difficult to understand, so I just wanted you to make sure you understand that. So I'll be back after the discussion to tell you a little bit more. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy.
All right, let's jump right in, folks. Today we're going to take a deep dive into a really fascinating but often overlooked part of Australian history. The Amoy Shepherds.
The Amoy Shepherds.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now, most people, when they think about early Chinese immigration to Australia, they immediately think about the gold rush, right?
Yeah.
But well before that, actually in the
That's
1840s and 50s, you had about 3,000 men who made this incredible journey to Australia, all the way from Amoy, which is now Xiamen in China.
That's right.
And this is a story that often gets overshadowed, right, by everything that happened later.
Yeah, it's a story that doesn't get told enough. And I think one of the things that makes it even more interesting is that these men weren't coming from the areas that we normally associate with early Chinese immigration.
Like Canton, Guangdong.
Right, like Guangdong.
Yeah.
Instead, they're coming from Fujian province,
Right.
which adds kind of another dimension to this whole story, you know?
It's like a missing piece of the puzzle, and it raises so many questions like, first of all, why Australia? You know, what were their lives like once they got here? And maybe the most intriguing question is, why did their story kind of fade from memory unlike other Chinese immigrants?
Absolutely. There's so much to uncover, and thankfully we have some amazing research to guide us today. Michael Williams has done some fantastic work on the Amoy Shepherds, piecing together their story. So let's start with Amoy itself. What was it like back then?
Yeah, give me a picture. What are we talking about here?
Well, Amoy was a bustling port city. It was in Fujian province, a major center for trade. And in a lot of ways, you can compare it to Canton or Guangdong because it had this long history of labor migration, particularly to Southeast Asia.
So this wasn't like their first time sending people overseas to work.
Not at all. Not at all. This is a well-established pattern. But things kind of shifted towards Australia with this key turning point, which was the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842.
Okay, yeah. The Opium Wars. Vaguely remember that from school.
Yeah, most people associate it with the opening up of trade with China, but it really set the stage for labor recruitment, too. You have the British who are, constantly looking for new sources of cheap labor, and suddenly they saw an opportunity in Amoy.
Okay, I'm seeing the connections here.
Yeah.
You've got Amoy, which already has this history of sending workers abroad. Then this treaty opens up this new market in Australia. Perfect timing, I guess.
Yeah, you could say that. And at the same time, on the Australian side, it's the 1840s. They're facing this massive labor shortage. Convict transportation had just ended, and they needed people to work, particularly on those huge sheep farms that were popping up everywhere.
The, what do they call them? The squattocracy.
Yes, exactly. The squattocracy, these wealthy landowners who controlled huge swaths of land.
They needed workers, and they needed them cheap.
Absolutely. So it's almost like this convergence, right? You have Amoy with a supply of labor, and you have Australia desperate for workers.
Supply and demand.
Exactly.
The market at work. Now, you mentioned that some colonists had actually tried to import Chinese labor even earlier. What happened there?
Right. So back in the 1830s, there was a guy named G.F. Davison who came up with this plan to bring in, I think it's hundreds of workers from China. But it ended up falling through for various reasons.
Ah.
But it just goes to show that this demand, this desire for cheap labor, was already there.
Yeah, it's simmering, just waiting for the right opportunity.
Exactly.
Now, okay, they get these workers, these Amoy Shepherds. What were the conditions like? I mean, let's talk about these
The
contracts.
contract.
Were they fair?
Well, fair is debatable. I think what we know for sure is that around 3,000 men came to New South Wales between 1848 and 1853, and it was all under these legally binding contracts. Contracts that were really designed, let's be honest, to protect the employer, not the worker.
Okay, so already some red flags. What did they actually say, these contracts?
Well, a typical contract, it would tie you in for 5 years. The wage, it was about £6 a year, plus some basic rations. Now, to put that in perspective, European workers were earning more than double that at the time.
That's outrageous.
Yeah.
And did these contracts even say what kind of work they'd be doing?
No. There were no specifics about the type of work or the conditions. And if that wasn't bad enough, the cost of the journey to Australia, that was deducted from their wages too.
So essentially they were trapped.
Yeah.
In a way,
Sounds less like a job opportunity and more like, well,
exploitation.
exploitation, yeah.
I mean, I think that's a fair assessment.
But to really understand what it was like, we need to go beyond the contracts themselves. Right?
Absolutely.
We need to hear their stories, their voices. We do. And unfortunately, firsthand accounts from the Amoy Shepherds themselves are incredibly rare. They weren't exactly keeping diaries or writing memoirs, but there are some glimpses. One particularly fascinating account comes from Dr. W.D.P. Swain. He was the ship's doctor on the Eleanor Lancaster, which sailed from Amoy to Australia in 1852.
Okay, so this is someone who was actually there who witnessed the journey.
Exactly. And thankfully, he kept a diary.
Oh, interesting.
And his entries, they provide a very, I'd say, harrowing picture of what conditions were like on board. He talks about rampant sickness, deaths during the voyage. There was this overall sense of discontent among the men. He even documented a suicide attempt, which really speaks to the level of despair that some must have felt.
Wow. It's one thing to know, objectively that the contracts were bad, but to actually hear about what that journey was like, it's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
It really challenges those, kind of romantic notions we might have about immigration in the past.
Right. It's a harsh reality check.
But here's the thing, human nature, right? I have to believe these men didn't just sit back and accept their fate. Did they resist? Did they fight back against the system?
Absolutely. And this is where their story takes a really interesting turn. Because despite everything, they did find ways to resist, to make their voices heard.
So how did they do that?
Well, there were a few ways. Some of them, they ran away. They tried to escape and make a better life for themselves beyond those exploitative contracts. Others, they actually took their complaints to court. They challenged the terms of their agreement.
Wow, so they were pushing back legally.
Yeah, they were. And believe it or not, we even have evidence of them organizing strikes.
Wait, strikes like in the 1850s?
In the 1850s, yeah. There's documentation of strikes like one that happened near a place called Guangdong in 1852. The men were protesting wage discrepancies between them and European workers. So clearly, they were becoming more aware of their own exploitation.
So they weren't just taking it lying down.
No, not at all.
That's pretty incredible. That's a side of the story you don't often hear.
Right. It shows their resilience, their refusal to just be silent. And we even have some amazing examples of their ingenuity when it came to overcoming language barriers.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, there's this fascinating case from 1850. There was a man named Ang Hing who was accused of manslaughter, and he had to defend himself in court. Now, imagine that. You're in a foreign legal system, you don't speak English, you might have limited literacy in written Chinese. How do you communicate?
Yeah, how do you even begin to defend yourself?
He used drawings, a mixture of words and sketches.
Wow.
Yeah, to try and get his point across.
That is incredible. That just speaks volumes about his determination, his will to be understood.
Exactly.
It really does challenge that image of the passive, exploited immigrant.
It does. These stories, these glimpses into their lives, they paint a much more complex and nuanced picture.
And it makes you wonder how their story could have been so easily forgotten.
Yeah, that's a question worth exploring.
Hmm.
But for now, we've only scratched the surface. What happened once their contracts ended?
Yeah.
How were they perceived by colonial society? And what legacy did they leave behind?
All great questions. Let's dive into that right after a quick. We've been talking about these Amoy Shepherds, these men who made this incredible journey from China to Australia in the 1840s and 50s. We talked about the tough contracts, the difficult voyage, and even their resistance, their pushback against the system.
Yeah.
But now I'm curious, how did Australians, the colonists, react to their presence?
Well, it was complicated, as you might imagine. There wasn't one single reaction. It was really a mixed bag. I mean, you have to remember, this is a society that's already grappling with a lot of changes.
Right.
The end of convict transportation.
Yeah.
This growing need for labor, anxieties about, who should be allowed to call Australia home.
Yeah, so picture this. You're a colonist, right? You've been in Australia for a few years. Maybe you're a former convict trying to make a new life. And all of a sudden, there are these 3,000 Chinese men arriving on your shores.
Right.
It's bound to cause some tension.
Absolutely. And it did. On the one hand, there was this element of sympathy for the Amoy Shepherds. I mean, when people saw the conditions they were brought in under, those contracts,
Yeah.
a lot of folks thought it was akin to slavery.
Yeah, that makes sense considering Australia had a convict past. Forced labor wasn't exactly a foreign concept to them.
Exactly. But at the same time, you also had fear of job competition, fears that these men would drive down wages. And of course, there was an underlying current of racial prejudice, too.
So is this idea of a white Australia already starting to take hold?
Oh, yeah. Those sentiments were definitely emerging. It really is a complex picture, right?
Yeah.
You have this concern for their welfare, but also this fear, this desire to protect their own interests.
It's almost a contradiction. And it gets even weirder, right? Because we mentioned earlier that some of these Amoy men were actually, respected as free workers.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the prejudice?
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher for sure. But I think it speaks to the adaptability of these men, their work ethic.
Uh-huh.
Once they were free from those awful contracts, they could actually showcase their skills, their value.
So they weren't just seen as cheap labor anymore.
Right. They could prove themselves as individuals. And I think it really challenged the preconceptions that some colonists might have had.
Mm-hmm.
One researcher even talked about the difficulty in reconciling the abuse they suffered during their indenture with the genuine support and appreciation they received later on.
But I do want to push back a little bit on that. Was that respect really widespread? Or was it limited to, certain contexts, certain individuals? I mean, we can't forget about John Johnson.
John Johnson, right. His story is so important because it exposes the limitations of that respect. Here's a man, he spoke English fluently, he had converted to Christianity, he seemed to have assimilated into colonial society.
You'd think he'd be accepted.
You'd think so.
Yeah.
And yet, he was brutally assaulted in Sydney in 1854.
Just a stark reminder that no matter how much they tried to fit in, they were still seen as outsiders by some.
It's a tragic story, and it really shatters this illusion that respect and acceptance were universal. Prejudice, it doesn't disappear overnight.
And it makes you think about all those other stories, the ones that we don't know about because they weren't documented. The everyday acts of discrimination that these men must have faced.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to another aspect of this story. Why is it so hard to find information about them?
Good question. It's a challenge for researchers, that's for sure.
Like, why the historical erasure?
Well, there are a few reasons. For one, a lot of Amoy Shepherds actually changed their names.
Really?
Yeah, it was a survival tactic, a way to blend in to avoid discrimination.
Yeah, if you're facing prejudice, changing your name might be the only way to protect yourself and your family.
Right. But of course, it makes it incredibly difficult for descendants to trace their lineage, to find those connections to the past.
And then there's that whole coolie myth that we talked about. This idea that all Chinese immigrants were just unskilled laborers brought in under these terrible conditions.
It's a harmful stereotype. And it really lumps all these different groups, all these different experiences together under one umbrella.
So it ignores the nuances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because of that, the unique story of the Amoy Shepherds, their origins in Fujian, their particular circumstances, it all gets lost.
It's important to remember that they weren't just Chinese. Even within that broad label, there were different cultures, different languages. I mean, the Amoy men spoke Hokkien, which is distinct from Cantonese, right?
It is, yeah. They weren't a monolithic group at all. And those differences, those linguistic and cultural differences, sometimes even led to tension between them and the Cantonese-speaking immigrants who came later.
It just adds another layer of complexity to this whole story.
It does.
Okay, we've talked about their arrival, their contracts, the reactions they faced, the challenges of researching their history. But then comes a massive turning point. The gold rush.
Mm.
How did that event shake things up for the Amoy Shepherds?
The gold rush was a game changer for everyone, really.
Yeah.
It was a seismic event. And for the Amoy Shepherds, it presented both opportunities and challenges, I think.
I bet. I mean, everyone was caught up in gold fever.
Yeah.
Did the Amoy men join in?
Many of them did.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. You've just finished 5 years of really hard labor under this terrible contract.
Yeah.
And suddenly there's a chance to get rich.
Yeah, to control your own destiny.
Exactly. So it's not surprising that many of them were drawn to the goldfields.
Did any of them actually strike it rich? Did they find gold?
Well, we do have some interesting evidence. There's a report from 1858 of 12 Amoy men who returned to China with, get this, over 3,000 pounds in savings.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of them, a guy named Han Ting, he supposedly had over 500 pounds to his name.
That's a small fortune back then.
It was. Of course, we don't know about all the ones who didn't find gold.
Right.
The ones who might have struggled and maybe even returned to China empty-handed.
Yeah, the ones whose stories we don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the point is, the gold rush gave them options. They could choose to stay on those farms or try their luck on the gold fields. They weren't bound by those contracts anymore.
It's almost like the gold rush accidentally gave them some bargaining power.
In a way, it did. And as they spread out across the gold fields, you know, that distinct identity, that Amoy Shepherd label,
Right.
it kind of faded.
They're just Chinese miners.
They were just Chinese miners. So while the gold rush offered all these opportunities, it also, in a sense, contributed to their historical erasure.
It's like their story got absorbed into this bigger narrative.
Exactly. Their journey, their experiences before the gold rush, they become harder to see. But those experiences are crucial to understanding the full picture.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, though, what happened to them next? Did they stay in Australia? Did any go back to China? What kind of legacy did they leave behind?
Those are great questions. We'll get into all that right after this.
It's been quite a journey with these Amoy Shepherds, hasn't it? From that bustling port city all the way to colonial Australia, the harsh realities of those contracts, and then that whirlwind of the gold rush. But there's still so much to uncover, like what happened after all that, what became of those Amoy Shepherds who stayed in Australia.
Well, their story really gets to the heart of their legacy, and it's a legacy that often gets overlooked or even misunderstood. You know, we talked about how their treatment changed once they were free from those contracts, how they went from being just cheap labor to being valued members of the workforce. But did that actually translate into building lives, integrating into society?
Did they manage to create a life for themselves here?
Yeah, for many of them, we find records of Moy men buying land, setting up businesses, getting married, raising families.
Do we have any specific examples, names that stand out?
Oh, absolutely. Take John Sidney, for instance. He was an Amoy Shepherd who actually became a naturalized British subject, which was a huge deal back then. It meant he could own land, participate more fully in society.
So he achieved a level of success and recognition that probably wouldn't have been possible under that initial contract.
Exactly. And there are others like him. Peter Amoy, he also gained naturalization. And then there's Thomas Stan Swan. Really interesting guy. He was a shopkeeper in rural Victoria. And of course, is the tragic story of Tim Tai, who was a successful cook in Queensland, but met a very unfortunate end.
It's amazing how these individual stories bring this whole historical narrative to life. You know, they weren't just statistics. These were real people with hopes and dreams, facing challenges and finding ways to make a life for themselves.
And their descendants are all around us today. Families like the Gams of Wollongong, the Tankies of Queensland, they can all trace their ancestry back to those Amoy Shepherds.
It's incredible to think their legacy is still woven into the fabric of modern Australia.
It really is.
Yeah.
But uncovering those connections, those family histories, can be really tricky, as we've discussed.
Right, because of the name changes.
Yeah, that's a big factor. And then the influx of Cantonese-speaking immigrants during the gold rush that really muddied the waters.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Amoy men, their distinct culture and language, it all got a bit lost in the mix.
Almost like their story was erased twice, first by the prejudice they faced, and then by the sheer scale of Chinese immigration that came later.
That's a really good point, and it makes their story all the more important to tell.
So we know some stayed and built lives here, but what about those who went back to China? Did any of them manage to return home?
It's tough to say for sure. Records are patchy, and many stories were just never recorded. But we do have evidence that some did return and some even went back with considerable wealth.
Really, I mean, we talked about Han Tang and those 12 men who returned with savings from the gold fields, but were there others who went back even before the gold rush?
There's a report from 1858 from Gaynda, the same place where Han Ting and those other men departed from. And it mentions a group of Amoy Shepherds who had finished their contracts and they were pooling their money to buy passage back to China.
So even in those harsh conditions, they were still able to save, to plan for a future back home.
Yeah, it really challenges this assumption that all Chinese immigrants came to Australia with the intention of staying permanently in Fom. For some, Australia was temporary, a way to earn money and then return to their families.
It really does make you wonder about all the stories we'll never know, the ones that just faded into history, but their experiences are just as important a part of the Australian story.
Absolutely, and it raises a question that I think historians are still debating. Why did the flow of migrants from Amoy essentially stop,
Hmm.
while migration from Guangdong just kept growing?
It is interesting, isn't it? Any theories out there?
Well, one explanation is the nature of their recruitment. Those exploitative contracts, those stories of coercion, even kidnapping.
It wasn't exactly a good advertisement for working in Australia.
Yeah. No, it wasn't. Word must have gotten back to Amoy about the conditions they were facing, and that probably discouraged others from making the journey.
Makes sense. It's a reminder that even within the system of exploitation, there was still communication information was still flowing back and forth.
Right, and another factor might be the rise of Hong Kong, as a major hub for Chinese emigration with its British administration, and that growing Cantonese-speaking population, it kind of overshadowed Amoy.
So the rise of Hong Kong might have inadvertently led to the fading of the Amoy Shepherds story. History's full of these unintended consequences, isn't it?
It really is, and as we wrap up our deep dive into their world, I think it's important to reflect on what their story teaches us about Australian history, about immigration, about our understanding of the past.
They challenge a lot of assumptions, don't they? We often think of Chinese immigration as this post-gold rush phenomenon, but the Amoy Shepherds were here well before that, shaping this country in ways we're only beginning to understand.
And their story forces us to look at that darker side of our past. The exploitation, the prejudice, the struggle for recognition.
Issues that are still relevant today, we're still grappling with questions of race labor belonging.
We are. But by learning about the Amoy Shepherds, by acknowledging their struggles, their triumphs, we get a deeper, more nuanced understanding of Australian history and the contributions of immigrants from all over the world.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. It's amazing what we can learn from a group of people whose story was almost lost to time.
It is, and who knows, maybe some of our listeners out there are descendants of these Amoy Shepherds. Maybe this will spark a curiosity to explore your own family histories, to uncover those connections to the past.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, their lives, their stories.
And even those whose names we may never know their stories still deserve to be heard, their experiences remembered.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deeper into those fascinating stories that make up our shared history.
Okay, thank you very much for listening to that. That was, as usual, very interesting discussion. I just want to say, if you want to know more about, say, the Ang Hing and his drawing in defence of his murder charge, you can go to 88 Objects. That's one of the many 88 objects. You'll see a picture of his drawings, an image of his drawings. It's quite a fascinating effort, and it's probably technically the first instance of Chinese-Australian writing in Australia, any significance anyway, both writing and, of course, a drawing as well. I just want to thank Maxine Darnell and Alison Lehard for their contributions to my research. Maxine Darnell in particular, of course, did a very wonderful PhD on the Amoy Shepherds in Australia, and a tremendous range of sources in there. Alison Lehart is someone who's actually descended of an Amoy person, and she's been doing a lot of family research, and her inspired research helped me to decide to do this project. So I just want to mention those two. As usual, our bots, I think, did a very interesting discussion. In the notes, I'll give you a couple of more references if you want a bit more information. But as I said, this book is not yet out, but will be out eventually. And of course, I'll be highlighting that when it does. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of a fairly obscure aspect of Chinese Australian history, but not obscure, of course, to those many people who are descendants of descendants of the Amoy Shepherds who have been, many of them, doing a lot of research to try and find out more. I recently myself went to Xiamen, to Amoy, to do some research and found the academics there know little or nothing about this history. I'm also going to London soon to do a bit more research, mostly just background research into that aspect of what was going on in Amoy around the time that people were being sent off. And there'll be some future podcasts about those aspects of that research as well. So once again, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.